Good morning, everyone. I'd first of all like to thank the organisers of this event for inviting me to present today. It's a great honour. Thank you very much. And this is a presentation that's not going to talk so much about strategies from a very high level. I'll try not to get too down in the weeds, and I'll try and touch on as many of the sustainability items that have been discussed this morning as well. Okay. This is essentially going to be a presentation on the history of the freshwater development and its management in Bermuda. As you can see, we live in a wonderful island, and I think I'm the only presenter from Bermuda, so I should take this opportunity to welcome you to the island, albeit on the final day of the conference, but I'm sure it still counts. Bermuda's geology, the limestone, is very porous. Typically 30% of its volume is air spaces, or if it's below the water table, it contains water, whether it be seawater, brackish water, or fresh water. The basalts, or the volcanics, are about 140 feet below sea level, and the limestone just sits on the top of that. And we don't have any freshwater rivers. There's no freshwater lakes. There are some ponds that are largely brackish, sometimes slightly fresh, but it can vary considerably. And they tend to be continuous with the groundwater, which is also then continuous with the seawater. So no matter where you stand in Bermuda, you're always standing over water. So many, feet down, hundreds of feet in this instance. Bear with me. Right, we have very high rainfall, 57 inches per year in Bermuda, but we do not have a wet season and a dry season. We typically get between 4 and 5 inches of rain every month, which has helped to drive the freshwater management that has existed since the early settlers arrived in Bermuda, and how they deal with freshwater collection and its use. Okay, this is a house of what an early settler's house may look like. You'll notice, first of all, there's a barrel tank in the garden. You'll see some pipes connecting that from the roof, and the roof will have a gutter. And this is basically how early settlers collected the rainwater into the tank and then used that for various purposes in the household. If you calculate the roof area, both the residential roof area, commercial roof area, and the various rain catches that are on the island, and then multiply that by the rainfall for those years, on this scale from 1961 to 2016, you can see there's quite a lot of variability. There are some periods of drought in that. And generally people are surviving, or they were surviving, on about 40 gallons per day. That's not sufficient for today's standards of what people require, and so we have to then look at supplemental water. So I'll come back to this. If you look here, you can see the population growth. It was very easy to calculate the amount of water per year, but the roof area changes were only calculated for 1 year, and then we calculated back, assuming that the population and the roof area were closely related. You can see here on these images, if I scroll down you might see now, okay, those red lines depict the catches of the rainwater, and this process was seen to be so effective that it was actually put into legislation. We have the Public Health Water Storage Regulations in 1951, and it's also in the Residential and Commercial Building Code as well, that you have to capture 80% of your roof area of rainwater to put that in a tank. And then there was a requirement on the water tank. Typically these are below the house, below one of the rooms. And you have to, according to the law, capture 10 gallons for every square foot of roof area. And you'll notice here with the water tank, you'll notice here with the water tank that there is a divide in the middle. It's continuous at high levels, but when you do run out of water, you do then have a switch over to the other half of the tank, a bit like on your motorbike if you run out of fuel. And if you're not monitoring your water, that's a bit of a godsend, really. So that's very useful. If, however, you run out of water, typically the size of the water tanks are sized for a 3-month duration. So if you have a 3-month drought, you should be fine for a typical household, 3-bedroom household, for example, not a condominium. But if you do run out of water, then you need to go to supplemental water. And this originally was from water truckers, and they typically charge around about $90 for 1,000 gallons. And if you're lucky to get one, you'll probably go for 2 loads. That's $180 for 2,000 gallons. If you're lucky enough to be connected to pipes water main, where they're treating to reverse osmosis standards, then you're paying typically around about $23 for 1,000 gallons, and you typically have to buy 1,000 every month. So that's how we deal with water shortages. But the early settlers also dug wells in addition to the collection in the water tanks from their roofs. They did dig wells that were over some of the freshwater lenses that I'll come on to shortly, and that was how they sustained their water. Watlington Waterworks was the first private company, started up in 1932, and then government started in about the 1960s to treat water and then put it down various water mains. These are the naturally forming freshwater lenses on the island. The western lenses, the Somerset and the Port Royal, are typically between about 4 and 6 meters thick, and that sits on brackish water that sits on seawater. So it sort of floats there like a glacier, except instead of 1/10 being above the groundwater, it's about 1/30. And these are used usually by private households. In the far east end, St. George's, that's a very thin lens. That's between 2 and 4 meters thick. So that's often described as brackish, because if you put a pump down there and it's high rated at such a value, you will actually start up coning the saline from below. The central lens, however, is a very thick lens. That's up to about 12 meters thick in parts of it. And this is used by the commercial abstractors, whether it be government or Watlington Waterworks, to treat. Okay. So the blue contour here is the 2-meter depth contour of the freshwater lens surrounding the central lens. And it was necessary to break the central lens up with modelling into various sectors, and to then basically allocate sectors to various organisations, and then to tell them they couldn't abstract over a certain amount. This came in after a very detailed scientific study in the 1970s that led to the Water Resources Act being created in 1975. And you can see there, based on the colour, whether the sectors have been allocated to government, to Bermuda Waterworks, the private supplier, who was sort of first in this business, and then to some of the private water truckers. We monitor the volume in those lenses every quarter, or if they're not in any critical state, then we may stretch that out to once a year. This is the water distribution. The blue line is the government, and the red line is the Bermuda Waterworks. And at the moment, government's in the process of selling or passing over the West End water main to the private contractor that tends to operate a little bit more efficiently. So other supplemental water, if you are lucky enough to be on a water main, then you will have access to saltwater reverse osmosis. These are the 3 government facilities, and then there are the private facilities as well. The central facility in Devonshire is rated at 1 million imperial gallons per day, and that actually receives its power from a steam turbine that's connected, receiving the waste heat from the municipal incinerator on the island. We don't have any organic landfills here. There is an inert landfill that you would have seen coming in by airplane down near the airport, and that just receives aggregates, metal waste. We're still trying to get the vehicles off the island. And it also receives ash from the incinerator that we mix with concrete or cement to make into concrete blocks, and those are used for sort of shore revetment along that area. So that's the seawater reverse osmosis plants that government owns. And if you add the supplemental water to the rain catch graph, this is a cumulative graph, so I've literally just added them all together. You can see the graph on the bottom is the Bermuda Waterworks Limited, the blue graph down here. And after the Water Resources Act were implemented in the mid-70s, you can see that we had to limit their abstraction from the sectors that they were operating from, because they were over-abstracting. And the issue with over-abstracting is if it does get replaced with saline, it's very difficult for that freshwater lens then to reoccur. It takes a lot longer. At the same time, government had access to a lot more sectors, and so you can see government's in red, the bar graph increasing significantly, but a little bit erratically, and it has dropped off of late, which we are addressing and looking to hand over some of those sectors, water rights, under the Water Resources Act to the private operator in this field, who, as you can see, they literally use the maximum, that's why that blue line is continuous really from about 1991, it hardly shifts. They literally use the maximum allocated water right of the lens because they know that it's far cheaper to squeeze fresh water out of, or potable water out of fresh water, 10 bar pressure through a reverse osmosis membrane than it is to squeeze it out of seawater with the osmotic potential. You need about 70 bars. And here in Bermuda we pay 40 to 45 cents a kilowatt, so it's a huge, huge cost. And then to make up the difference, Watlington Waterworks, you can see the purple graph here is what they generate through seawater reverse osmosis, and the government is the green graph, seawater reverse osmosis as well. And then the little blue line is what the truckers supply, so it's not really an industry per se, it's more of a family business in many instances. And you'll notice that if we take that total water generated and divide it by the population, over time you can see that we've gone from about 40 gallons per person per day up to about 60. So that sort of reflects the current usage in Bermuda. Okay, we have about 4,000 water rights under the Water Resources Act. The blue dots are the wells. Most of them are people who want to supplement their water for toilet flushing, or if they're lucky enough to be over a freshwater lens, they will use the well water for laundry. And the red symbols are the boreholes, disposal boreholes. So the wells will be for anything from, as I've said, toilet flushing, laundry. We've heard about the commercial abstractors. You can also use it for water cooling, so you have to spend less on your air conditioning. And you can use it for irrigation as well if you're over a freshwater lens. Similarly, the boreholes are used to receive treated wastewater from aerated sewage treatment plants and also from some septic tanks. And they're also used for the return on the cooling water and rainwater, stormwater management as well. So there's quite a few there, keeps us busy. These are only renewed every 5 years, otherwise it'd be an administrative nightmare. So that's how that works. And then if you add to that same graph the amount of water from wells that is used for toilet flushing or for laundry, you can see that it's non-potable uses. You can't use it for filling your water tank, although it used to be used for that instance, and then obviously they had to sterilize it, and then I'll come on to it in a minute, the nitrate levels rose considerably. This is a standard liner for a cesspit that's being installed in the limestone. And this is an interesting graph. Basically, as the amount of urbanization, the amount of road cover, roof cover increases, the amount of land for evapotranspiration goes down, the amount of water that actually gets to recharge the lens goes up considerably. Obviously, anything for the roof goes into a water tank, then into a cesspit, and percolates down into the water table. And similarly from roads as well, it's directed to deep sealed boreholes. So basically, the urbanization of Bermuda has helped to sustain a lot of the groundwater resources. And we've had challenges. Obviously, nitrate levels started to rise, so they had to shift from just pure sterilization of the potable water that is treated before it's sent out on the water main to go into reverse osmosis. That was back in the 1970s for the fresh water. Similarly, if you've got wells near some of the marshes, you can have hydrogen sulfide contamination, and the water companies tend to use that to their advantage. Rather than taking out the hydrogen sulfide by sparging and acidification before the treatment of the reverse osmosis, they put the reducing water through the reverse osmosis plant where they get less corrosion of their stainless steel components, and then they will sparge out the hydrogen sulfide at the end when it's ready to go to storage through a final sand filter. Okay, here you can see for some of the most densely populated areas, the rise in nitrate was considerable in the 1970s, which triggered the switch from sterilization of the groundwater to filtration, to reverse osmosis, typically. And in terms of wastewater treatment, this is basically out of one of our operating policies. Whenever there's a development, if somebody comes to us, they need to determine through the planning process what level of treatment they need. A smaller development can get away with a cesspit unless it's in a sensitive area, in which case we ask for a septic tank treatment to a deep sealed borehole or soak away. If it's a larger number of bedrooms, then we may ask for aerated treatment to a secondary standard, and finally to a tertiary standard for the much bigger developments. And obviously there's costs associated with that. There's also benefits as well. So the numbers on the tops of those boxes typically reflects 20,000 cesspits in Bermuda, about 300 septic tanks, 14 secondary treatment plants, which are typically in condominiums, hotels, and corporations, and 4 tertiary plants, which again, very large plants, very, very costly to operate. All of these aerated sewage treatment plants need licenses under the Clean Air Act and construction permits, so they come to us for that. We then will set limits on the treatment quality. If you then want to reuse that wastewater, we will then typically crib off the US EPA reuse guidelines. We don't need to reinvent any wheels, and we will then set the standard for that for the water reuse, whether it be for toilet flush or irrigation, golf courses and things like that, where there's a risk of it coming into contact with people. In fact, this hotel here has got a secondary aerated sewage treatment plant. It puts the treated wastewater into the pond in the front on South Shore, where there's some reeds and so on. That is then used as a reservoir for irrigation, and then they take from that pond and put it through the deflocculating agents and sand filters. Antiseptic is added, and then a faint blue dye, and you'll notice it may be coming back to you in your toilet flush water. In fact, as was mentioned earlier, there will be a tour, I believe, of just the water processing. I don't think we'll be traipsing people over and through the sewage treatment plant, but you never know. Yeah, and there's measures there as well of what the effluent qualities are typical. So secondary is typically 20 or 30 milligrams per litre suspended solids BOD, and tertiary can achieve less than 10 milligrams, usually a lot less. I did mention sensitive areas. We don't let all developments put in cesspits where the wastewater that effectively gets treated through the aerated geology, the limestone, before it hits the water table. There's certain places where they can't put them. And those sensitive areas relate to, first of all, the level of limestone that's got air in it beneath the cesspit to the water table. If it's too shallow, less than 4 feet or typically less than 10 foot at grade, then we'll ask them to put in a septic tank to a deep seal borehole. If they're very close to the coast, then they, within 40 feet, then they can't put a cesspit in either. So all those blue areas depict the water protection areas that basically instructs planning what to expect and what the developers what to expect in terms of the level of treatment they need to provide in those areas. And then finally, we have caves in Bermuda. Some of the older limestone has had a lot of dissolution, especially over the glaciation periods, so we've got some marvellous caves here. And those are just, the red stars are just the places where the caves have entrances at the surface. We have some unique species in these caves, so we don't want obviously this wastewater to percolate down into them, so we set limitations on them. In fact, up at Morgan's Point, where there's some development going on at the moment of a brownfield site, it was a bit of a land swap because the developer was going to develop some of the beautiful area on South Shore that was, you know, very greenfield, and we didn't want that developed, and they did a land swap with what was the old American base at Morgan's Point. The deep seal borehole that was drilled 140 foot down from grade, 80 foot sealed, needs to be, went through a few cave-ish type areas, sort of brachia type areas, which wouldn't work when you came to then put the seal part in of the concrete. So we've just brought in a new to Bermuda, I think it exists already many places in the States, a flute system, whereby we put a liner down, and that's been installed now, and we're literally about to start grouting the outside of a smaller PVC pipe that'll be 12 inches diameter. So that's a way that ultimately we can stop any impact to caves, and within those caves you would probably just see a concrete shaft with this liner around it. So that's the first for Bermuda we did last Saturday. Okay. These are just some pictures of the secondary wastewater, tertiary wastewater treatment plants in Bermuda. These are some of the sewer mains that exist. There's one at the west end, WEDCO, which is a quango of government, that treats to a tertiary level and then sends the wastewater back out as toilet flush water. It's a bit of a win-win because they generate the potable water as well, not from the wastewater. So there's 3 bills basically if you're on the WEDCO line that you're going to get from them. At the far east we have the Corporation of St George's, and in the middle we have Corporation of Hamilton, which I've got some more slides on. Basically the disposal boreholes are connected to septic tanks. The treatment plants you can see with the square symbols, and in fact this square symbol here is the Southampton Princess. Sorry, Fairmont Southampton. Got to get the name right. There's 2 of us. That's right. And yeah, there's pump stations and so on. This is the Corporation of Hamilton. So there's some government facilities, Cedar Bridge, there's a septage facility by the incinerator, and there's another government schools out here, and then there's some developments in the back of town. The Corporation of Hamilton is this square area here, but we collect the wastewater from other places as well. There is what was a 6mm screen, now a 3mm screen, and they're looking to put in a microscreen this year with possibly looking at peracetic acid injection also, that would have the residence time in the outfall, or to the outfall rather, to provide some sterilization capability. Also feeding into this line is the hospital here, which is treating, the new hospital, which is treating to a tertiary standard, so that's literally adding clear wastewater into this raw but screened wastewater to the outfall. Corporation of St. George's, which is the old city in Bermuda, has a sewer main as well with an outfall also. I'll just finish up by then saying that the Department of Health does monitor the beaches here, and we monitor to the US EPA requirements, and this is the 2016 data, so it's generally very, very good. And I think that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.